March 15, 1944. 1:37 p.m., 28,000 feet above the German-Belgian border. The air at this altitude was thin enough to kill. Not slowly, through gradual suffocation, but quickly, within minutes if a pilot lost pressurization or oxygen supply. The cold was absolute, 40 degrees below zero, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in seconds, that moisture in breath would crystallize instantly, that hydraulic fluid thickened and control surfaces responded sluggishly to inputs. At 28,000 feet, the sky was a deeper blue than existed at sea level, a color that seemed almost black at the edges of vision, and the sun was painfully bright without the atmospheric filtering that made it tolerable below. This was where 2nd Lieutenant Robert Johnson flew his P-47 Thunderbolt, throttle pushed forward to military power, 8.50 caliber machine guns armed and ready, scanning the empty sky for targets that intelligence had promised would be there. The supercharger whined as it force-fed compressed air into the big radial engine, maintaining power in atmosphere so thin that an unsupercharged engine would barely idle. Below, 30,000 feet below, the patchwork of Belgian farms and German industrial cities looked like a map rather than terrain. Above, there was nothing but the curve of the earth and the black edge of space. At 1:38 p.m., Johnson's radio crackled with the call he'd been waiting for. Bandits 11 o'clock high, Angels 30. Enemy aircraft higher still at 30,000 feet. Impossible according to every intelligence brief he'd received. Impossible according to captured Luftwaffe documents that listed service ceilings. Impossible according to the confident assessments of senior officers who had assured the 56 Fighter Group that their P-47s could reach altitudes that German fighters couldn't match. Johnson pulled back on the stick, added power, and began climbing toward targets that weren't supposed to exist at that altitude. The Thunderbolt, all 8 tons of it, clawed upward through air too thin to provide proper lift. The rate of climb dropped from 3,000 feet per minute at sea level to barely 800 feet per minute at 28,000. Every 1,000 feet gained felt like a victory against physics. At 1:41 p.m., Johnson leveled off at 30,000 feet and found himself looking up at Focke-Wulf 190's Flying Combat Air Patrol, another 2,000 feet above him. The European Air War in early 1944 was reaching its decisive phase, though few participants understood this at the time. The strategic bombing campaign, designed to destroy German industrial capacity and break civilian morale, had been underway for 2 years with mixed results. British night raids devastated cities but achieved limited precision against specific industrial targets. American daylight raids promised greater accuracy but suffered catastrophic losses to German fighter defenses. By March 1944, the attrition rate for American bomber crews had reached levels that were statistically unsurvivable. The average crewman's chance of completing a required 25 mission tour was roughly 1 in 3. The losses weren't sustainable. The campaign wasn't achieving its strategic objectives. And German fighter production, far from being crippled by bombing, was actually increasing. The Luftwaffe was winning the air superiority battle over occupied Europe. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, specifically the P-47 Thunderbolt and, later, the P-51 Mustang, was supposed to solve this crisis by providing bomber formations with protection throughout their missions deep into German territory. In theory. In practice, the early escort missions revealed a fundamental problem. German fighters could choose the terms of engagement. They could wait until escorts reached their range limits and turn back, then attack bombers without interference. Or they could engage at altitudes where escort fighters performed poorly. Or they could simply avoid combat when odds were unfavorable, preserving strength for more advantageous situations. The Luftwaffe controlled German airspace. They had radar warning systems, they had altitude advantage from central positioning, and they had experienced pilots flying aircraft optimized for defense of the homeland. American fighters arriving as intruders in this environment faced every possible disadvantage except one. They had better aircraft than intelligence reports suggested, and German intelligence was slow to recognize this. The P-47 Thunderbolt was, by most measures, an absurd aircraft. It weighed 8 tons fully loaded, twice the weight of a Spitfire, nearly 3 times the weight of a Japanese Zero. It was powered by a massive radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower through a turbo-supercharger system so complex that early models spent more time under maintenance than in combat. It carried 8.50 caliber machine guns with enough ammunition to fire for approximately 40 seconds of sustained combat. Its range was limited, its maneuverability was poor at low altitudes, and it looked, according to one pilot's description, like a milk jug with wings. What it had, what made it dangerous despite these apparent limitations, was the ability to fight at altitudes where other aircraft couldn't operate effectively. The turbo-supercharger, that complex and maintenance-intensive system, maintained engine power at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The heavy airframe, a liability in low-altitude maneuvering, provided stability and durability at high altitude. The 8 heavy machine guns delivered more firepower in a single pass than any other fighter in operational service. The P-47 wasn't elegant. It was effective. German fighter pilots in early 1944 expected to encounter P-47s as they had encountered them throughout 1943, escorting bombers at altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, maneuvering sluggishly, vulnerable to diving attacks from above. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine emphasized altitude advantage and diving attacks, using gravity to build speed that could be converted back into altitude after the attack pass. A Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 at 30,000 feet could dive on escorts below, make a high-speed firing pass, then zoom back up beyond effective retaliation range. This tactic worked because German fighters owned the altitude. They could patrol at 30,000 feet indefinitely. American escorts, or so intelligence assessments maintained, could barely reach 28,000 and couldn't sustain combat operations above that altitude. Therefore, altitude belonged to the defenders. Therefore, diving attacks could be executed without risk of counter-ambush from above. What the German pilots climbing to 32,000 feet on the afternoon of March 15, 1944, didn't know, what their intelligence briefings hadn't told them because the information hadn't reached operational units, was that recent modifications to P-47 supercharger boost settings had increased their service ceiling by nearly 3,000 feet. The aircraft they expected to encounter at 25,000 feet were now capable of reaching 31,000. The altitude advantage that German tactics depended on no longer existed. But doctrine changes slowly, especially when it's built on assumptions that have been valid for months. So Luftwaffe formations continued climbing to altitudes they believed were safe, continued positioning for diving attacks against targets they believed were below them, and discovered, suddenly violently, that the Americans had climbed to meet them. At 1:43 p.m., Robert Johnson spotted the Focke-Wulf formation 2,000 feet above and beginning their dive. Standard German tactics. Except Johnson was 1,000 feet higher than German intelligence said was possible. And his flight, 8 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group, had anticipated this exact tactical approach. Instead of reacting defensively to the diving attack, they began their own climb to intercept. The FW-190s, committed to their dive and building speed, couldn't easily abort. They came down through 30,000 feet through 29,000, accelerating toward a bomber formation that was suddenly much less vulnerable than expected because the escorts weren't below. They were level, they were close, and they were turning into the attack with closure rates that gave German pilots seconds instead of minutes to react. The sound that defined this moment, the recurring auditory signature that would come to represent American air superiority in the European theater, was the synchronized firing of 8.50 caliber machine guns. Each P-47 carried 8 guns. Each gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute, which meant a single aircraft could deliver more than 6,000 rounds per minute of combined fire. The sound was distinctive. Not the sharp crack of individual shots, but a sustained roar, like heavy canvas being torn. A sound so violent it could be heard inside cockpits over the engine noise and wind blast. When multiple P-47s fired simultaneously, the acoustic signature was overwhelming, a physical force that announced American presence and American firepower to everyone within miles. It was abundance made audible. It was the industrial capacity of Detroit and Connecticut translated into sustained automatic fire at altitudes where breathing required supplemental oxygen and temperature made exposed metal painful to touch. The first FW-190 exploded at 1:44 p.m., hit by convergent fire from 2 P-47s whose pilots had coordinated their attack without radio communication, reading each other's intentions through aircraft positioning alone. The German pilot never ejected, either killed in the initial burst or unable to evacuate an aircraft that disintegrated around him. Pieces of airframe tumbled through 30,000 feet of atmosphere, spreading across miles of sky as they fell, eventually impacting in Belgian countryside, where farmers would collect the debris and hide it from German occupation authorities. The second FW-190 took hits in the engine and began trailing black smoke, its pilot attempting to dive away but losing airspeed as the damaged engine lost power, eventually spinning into controlled descent that would end with a crash landing in occupied territory. The third aircraft broke left, the fourth broke right, and suddenly the coordinated diving attack had become individual survival as German pilots realized they were engaged with escorts that shouldn't exist at this altitude. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine in 1944 was built on years of combat experience stretching back to the Spanish Civil War. German fighter pilots were, on average, far more experienced than their American counterparts. Many had hundreds of combat missions, some had over 1,000. They had developed tactics through trial and error in actual combat, had refined those tactics against British, Russian, and American opponents, and had institutional knowledge that made them exceptionally dangerous. But doctrine built on experience becomes vulnerable when the underlying conditions change. When the fundamental assumptions that German fighters owned altitude advantage, that American escorts couldn't reach 30,000 feet, that diving attacks could be executed with minimal risk. When those assumptions proved false, all the experience and institutional knowledge became temporarily irrelevant. The Luftwaffe pilots engaging the 56 Fighter Group that afternoon were flying perfect tactical patterns against an enemy that had changed the rules without warning. By 1:47 p.m., the engagement had spread across 50 miles of airspace and 10,000 feet of altitude. Some German pilots were diving to escape, trading altitude for speed in hopes of outrunning pursuers. Some were climbing, trying to regain altitude advantage and reset the engagement on terms they understood. Some were attempting to maneuver, to use the FW-190's excellent roll rate and the Me-109's tight turning radius to create firing opportunities. All were discovering that the P-47 at high altitude was not the sluggish escort they expected. The heavy weight that made it ponderous at low altitude became an advantage at 30,000 feet, where thin air provided minimal resistance and inertia carried the aircraft through maneuvers that would have required impossible control inputs at sea level. The big radial engine, maintaining power through the turbo supercharger, gave the Thunderbolt performance that matched or exceeded German fighters in conditions where those fighters were operating at the edge of their performance envelope. Historical records from the 56th Fighter Group's after-action reports document the engagement's progression with clinical precision. At 1:43, initial contact with enemy fighters at 32,000 feet. At 1:44, first confirmed kill. At 1:46, second and third kills confirmed. By 1:50, the initial German formation, estimated at 40 to 50 aircraft, had been scattered across Belgium and Western Germany, with individual dogfights occurring at various altitudes. American pilots reported aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft attempting to disengage, which was military language for hunting down German fighters trying to escape. The psychological transformation implicit in that phrase, from defending bombers against superior numbers to actively hunting enemy fighters, represented a shift in the air war's fundamental dynamics. The hunters had become the hunted. The altitude that had been German sanctuary had become contested airspace. And the P-47s that were supposed to be outclassed at high altitude were killing experienced Luftwaffe pilots with a casualty ratio that would eventually reach 23 confirmed German losses against 2 P-47s damaged and 1 lost. The emotional experience of German pilots during this engagement is documented in post-war interviews and contemporary operational reports. Hauptmann Heinrich Sturm, an ace with 47 kills and over 300 combat missions, described the March 15th engagement in his debriefing report. "We were at our operational ceiling, expecting to engage American escorts at least 2,000 meters below us. Instead, we found Thunderbolts at our altitude, climbing to meet us. This should not be possible according to our intelligence briefings. The aircraft's performance characteristics, as we understood them, do not permit such operations. Either our intelligence is catastrophically wrong, or the Americans have made significant technical modifications that we were not warned about." The language is formal, military, but the underlying emotion is clear: confusion, frustration, and the dawning realization that tactical assumptions built on months of experience were suddenly invalid. Another account, from a less senior pilot who survived being shot down that afternoon, is more direct. Lieutenant Carl Fisher, interviewed by American intelligence officers after his capture, stated, "They were everywhere, at every altitude, with more ammunition than seemed possible. When we dove, they followed. When we climbed, they were already there. How do they have so many bullets? How do they keep shooting? Our guns fire for 6 seconds, maybe 8 if you are careful. There's fire forever." The exaggeration is understandable. P-47s carried enough ammunition for roughly 40 seconds of sustained fire, not forever, but Fisher's perception reflects a real material disparity. German fighters typically carried 60 to 90 seconds of ammunition for their cannon and machine gun combinations. P-47s carried ammunition loads 2 to 3 times that capacity, allowing sustained engagement that felt to opponents like inexhaustible supply. The symbolic object that came to represent American material superiority in air combat wasn't the aircraft itself but the ammunition. Specifically, the .50 caliber cartridges that American fighters fired in quantities that seemed impossible to Luftwaffe pilots conditioned to strict ammunition discipline. Each P-47 carried approximately 3,400 rounds across its 8 guns, roughly 425 rounds per gun. By comparison, an FW-190 carried approximately 500 rounds total for its 2 MG-151-20 cannons and 900 rounds for its machine guns. The American fighter carried nearly 4 times the ammunition load of its German counterpart, and the .50 caliber rounds, while individually less powerful than 20 mm cannon shells, could be fired in such quantity that the cumulative effect exceeded cannon fire. German pilots were trained to conserve ammunition, to fire in short bursts, to disengage when ammunition ran low. American pilots fired longer bursts, engaged multiple targets per sortie, and still returned to base with ammunition remaining. This wasn't superior training or tactics. This was industrial capacity translated directly into combat advantage. By 2:15 p.m., the engagement was effectively over. The remaining German fighters had disengaged, either through successful evasion or because they were low on fuel and ammunition. The bomber stream the escorts were protecting had continued unmolested to its target and was now turning for home. The 56th Fighter Group reformed, conducted damage assessments, and began the return flight to England. Behind them, across Belgium and Western Germany, 23 German aircraft were down, 11 pilots killed, 12 captured. 2 P-47s had sustained damage from defensive fire, and 1 had been forced to crash land in Allied territory due to engine damage. The kill ratio was better than 10 to 1. More significantly, the psychological impact extended far beyond the actual losses. The Luftwaffe had discovered that altitude advantage could no longer be assumed. American escorts could reach altitudes previously considered safe. This meant German tactics needed revision. This meant intelligence assessments were wrong. This meant the air superiority that Germany had maintained over occupied Europe for years was slipping away. The transformation in American fighter pilot psychology following engagements like March 15th was profound and strategically significant. Early escort missions had been defensive in character: protect the bombers, avoid getting drawn away from the formation, survive to escort another day. Pilots were explicitly briefed that their primary mission was bomber protection, not fighter engagement. By spring 1944, that defensive mentality was shifting toward aggressive fighter sweeps. The P-47s and P-51s that had been employed as escorts were increasingly used as hunters, ranging ahead of bomber formations to clear airspace, pursuing enemy fighters that attempted to disengage, taking the fight to German airfields and staging areas. This shift from defensive to offensive air operations didn't happen because of command decisions. It happened because pilots discovered their aircraft were capable of dominating engagements when employed aggressively. The technology enabled the tactical evolution. The tactical evolution changed the strategic character of the air war. German fighter pilot training in 1944 was struggling to keep pace with losses. The experienced aces who had defined Luftwaffe fighter tactics were increasingly rare, killed in combat or withdrawn from frontline service to train replacement pilots. The replacements arrived at operational units with minimal flight time, inadequate gunnery training, and almost no combat experience. They were thrown into battle against American pilots who, while often equally inexperienced, were flying superior aircraft with reliable engines, abundant ammunition, and fuel loads that permitted extended combat operations. The material disparity was becoming a quality disparity. German pilot skill was still high among surviving aces, but the average German fighter pilot in spring 1944 was less capable than his American counterpart, and the gap was widening as losses mounted. The March 15th engagement entered Luftwaffe operational lore as the day the Americans climbed to impossible altitudes and destroyed an entire formation in conditions that should have favored the defenders. The specific details varied in retelling. Some accounts had 50 American fighters. Others claimed the P-47s were flying at 35,000 feet. All were characterized by disbelief that the enemy had achieved surprise in conditions where surprise shouldn't be possible. German intelligence officers spent weeks trying to determine what had changed, analyzing captured P-47 components, interrogating prisoners, monitoring American radio traffic for clues about technical modifications. They eventually concluded that supercharger boost settings had been increased beyond previous operational limits, gaining altitude performance at the cost of engine reliability. They were correct. What they couldn't solve was how to counter it. German fighter designs were optimized for operations between 20,000 and 28,000 feet. Modifications to increase service ceiling would require engine changes that German industry couldn't produce in sufficient quantity while maintaining current production rates of existing models. The technological gap was real and, given German industrial constraints, unsolvable. Robert Johnson returned from the March 15th mission with 3 confirmed kills and ammunition remaining. His combat report, filed that evening, noted, "Engaged enemy fighters at 30,000 feet. Enemy appeared surprised by our presence at this altitude. Pressed attack through defensive maneuvers. Expended approximately 1,200 rounds across 3 firing passes. Aircraft performance was excellent throughout engagement. The language is understated, professional, drained of emotion in the way of official reports. It doesn't capture the adrenaline of combat at 6 miles altitude, the cold that penetrated flight suits and made fingers clumsy on triggers, the tunnel vision that developed during high-G maneuvers in thin air, or the savage satisfaction of watching an enemy aircraft break apart under sustained .50 caliber fire. The report documents facts. The emotional reality was more complex and less suitable for official documentation. The recurring sound of .50 caliber fire, that tearing canvas roar that announced American presence, became increasingly familiar to German pilots through the spring of 1944. It meant American fighters were close, were engaging, were employing their primary tactical advantage of overwhelming firepower. Luftwaffe pilots learned to listen for it, to react to its presence the way infantry learned to react to artillery fire. When you heard that sound, you needed to maneuver immediately, aggressively, because 8 guns firing simultaneously from a single aircraft could shred a fighter's airframe in seconds. The sound carried psychological weight beyond its immediate tactical meaning. It represented industrial capacity, ammunition abundance, and an enemy that could afford to fire thousands of rounds in a single engagement while German pilots rationed their much more limited ammunition loads. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively conceded daylight air superiority over occupied Western Europe. German fighters still flew, still inflicted casualties on bomber formations and escort fighters, but they no longer controlled the airspace. American fighters ranged freely, attacking ground targets, strafing airfields, engaging any German aircraft that ventured into contested skies. The transformation from defensive escort operations to offensive air superiority missions was complete. The P-47s that had been designed to protect bombers were now hunting German fighters wherever they could be found. The strategic impact was immediate and devastating to German war production. Factories that had survived bombing attacks couldn't operate efficiently when workers spent hours in shelters during air raid alerts. Transportation networks that had maintained functionality despite damage couldn't move goods when American fighters strafed trains and trucks in daylight. The material advantages that America had developed through industrial production were being applied directly to German infrastructure without effective counter. The March 15th engagement produced one additional effect that wouldn't be fully understood until post-war analysis. It contributed to German strategic decisions about fighter allocation. The Luftwaffe was fighting on 3 fronts by spring 1944, defending Germany against Western Allied bombers, supporting ground operations on the Eastern Front, and maintaining coastal defenses against expected invasion. The destruction of an entire fighter formation in a single afternoon engagement over Belgium emphasized the cost of contesting Western Allied air superiority. German High Command began pulling fighter units from the Eastern Front to reinforce Western air defenses, which meant Soviet air forces faced reduced opposition, which accelerated Soviet advances. The strategic cascade effect of 23 German fighters lost in one engagement extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Those losses influenced resource allocation decisions that affected entirely different theaters of war. Lieutenant Johnson flew 68 more combat missions before his tour ended in June 1944. He was credited with 28 aerial victories, making him one of the leading American aces of the European theater. After the war, he wrote a memoir that barely mentioned the March 15th engagement, devoting more space to crash landings, mechanical failures, and the boredom of cross-channel flights than to his most successful combat mission. In interviews decades later, when historians asked about specific engagements, he consistently deflected personal credit. We had better aircraft. We had more ammunition. We had fuel enough to stay in the fight. The Luftwaffe had good pilots, but they were flying airplanes that couldn't match the P-47's performance at altitude. It wasn't fair. It wasn't supposed to be fair. The assessment is brutally accurate. Air combat in 1944 wasn't about individual dueling prowess. It was about systemic advantages compounding into overwhelming tactical superiority. The .50 caliber cartridges that American fighters fired by the tens of thousands represented a logistics chain that extended from combat over Europe back through England's airfields, across the Atlantic via convoy, through American factories in Connecticut and Massachusetts, to raw material sources across the United States. Each cartridge was proof that America's industrial base was untouched by war, operating at full capacity, producing ammunition in quantities that seemed wasteful by any standard except winning. German factories were bombed repeatedly, operated with slave labor, struggled with raw material shortages, and still produced remarkable quantities of ammunition, but not enough. Not enough to give fighter pilots the same ammunition loads as their opponents. Not enough to permit the same sustained fire. Not enough to overcome the material disparity that defined every engagement. The transformation in how American pilots thought about air combat over Europe can be traced through official guidance documents and tactical bulletins issued to fighter groups. Early 1943 documents emphasized conservation of fuel, of ammunition, of aircraft. Don't engage unless necessary. Protect the bombers above all else. Return to base with ammunition and fuel remaining. By spring 1944, the guidance had shifted. Engage enemy fighters aggressively. Pursue to the edge of fuel range. Expend ammunition as necessary to destroy enemy aircraft. The change wasn't subtle. It reflected the material reality that America could afford to be wasteful in combat. The industrial capacity existed to replace ammunition, to repair aircraft, to maintain fighter strength even while expanding operations. The Luftwaffe couldn't match this. They were conserving, rationing, trying to maintain combat effectiveness with shrinking resources. Conservation fails against abundance. Rationing fails against waste. The material disparity was becoming decisive. German pilots who survived the March engagement and continued flying combat missions through the spring described a progressive deterioration in their tactical situation. More American fighters, better performance, aggressive tactics, declining German numerical strength as losses outpaced replacement production. Hauptmann Heinrich Sturm, the experienced ace who had filed the confused after-action report on March 15th, was killed in combat over France on May 3, 1944. His aircraft was hit by fire from a P-47 during a low-altitude strafing mission. No one saw him eject. His body was recovered by German forces and buried with military honors. He had 49 confirmed kills at the time of his death and was one of the most experienced fighter pilots remaining in the Western theater. His loss represented the progressive attrition of Luftwaffe quality that no amount of replacement pilot production could offset. The P-47 that Robert Johnson flew on March 15th, aircraft serial number 42 to 8487, survived the war and was eventually returned to the United States for surplus disposal. It flew 126 combat missions, was credited with portions of 11 aerial victories, and sustained reparable damage on 3 separate occasions. The aircraft was scrapped in 1946, cut apart for aluminum recycling, its components melted down and repurposed for civilian production. No plaque marks its service. No museum preserves it. The aircraft was a tool that performed its function and was disposed of when no longer needed. This was the American approach to military equipment in World War II. Produce in quantity, employ until worn out, discard and replace. The approach was wasteful by any economic measure except winning wars. There's a photograph from March 16, 1944, taken at the 56th Fighter Group's airfield in England. The pilots from the previous day's mission are assembled in front of a P-47, and someone has painted 23 small swastikas on the fuselage below the cockpit, one for each German aircraft destroyed. The pilots are smiling, some are smoking, all look younger than their years. Robert Johnson is in the second row, squinting against the morning sun, looking uncomfortable with the attention. The photograph was taken for Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, and appeared with a caption about American fighter superiority over Europe. What the photograph doesn't show is the attrition rate among fighter pilots. Not as catastrophic as bomber crews, but significant, or the odds that several men in the photograph wouldn't survive the war. What it does show is confidence, the specific confidence of young men who have discovered their flying superior equipment against an increasingly desperate enemy. The strategic air campaign over Europe would continue for another 14 months, from March 1944 until the German surrender in May 1945. The character of that campaign was fundamentally shaped by engagements like March 15, where American fighters demonstrated they could not only escort bombers but actively hunt and destroy German fighters in conditions that were supposed to favor the defenders. The Luftwaffe never recovered air superiority. They continued to inflict losses, continued to defend German airspace, but they did so as an increasingly outnumbered and outmatched force facing opponents with better aircraft, more fuel, and unlimited ammunition. The material advantages that America's industrial base provided were translated into air superiority, and that air superiority enabled the broader strategic bombing campaign that devastated German industry and transportation networks. But the victory wasn't inevitable and wasn't achieved through industrial capacity alone. It required aircraft designs that could exploit altitude advantages. It required modifications to supercharger systems that increased service ceiling beyond original specifications. It required tactics that emphasized aggressive pursuit rather than defensive escort. It required pilots willing to engage at altitudes where hypoxia was a constant threat and cold was debilitating. The combination of material advantage and tactical adaptation created air superiority. Neither alone would have been sufficient. The epilogue to the March 15 engagement is written in production statistics and strategic assessments that most participants never saw. German fighter production in early 1944 was actually increasing. They were building more aircraft per month than at any previous point in the war. But pilot training programs couldn't maintain pace with losses. Aircraft sat on airfields without trained pilots. Fuel shortages grounded units that had both aircraft and pilots. The industrial base was still producing, but the system surrounding that production was collapsing under the weight of sustained Allied pressure. By contrast, American fighter production was increasing while simultaneously improving quality. Newer P-47 models had better superchargers, more ammunition capacity, increased range. The material gap was widening rather than narrowing. 28,000 feet above Belgium, in air so thin and cold that human life couldn't naturally exist, the future of the European air war was decided on a March afternoon when German fighters discovered that Americans had climbed to altitudes that intelligence assessments said were impossible. The discovery came too late. The tactical adjustments couldn't compensate for the underlying material disparity. The individual German pilot skill that had sustained the Luftwaffe through years of combat was no longer sufficient against opponents flying better aircraft with more ammunition and fuel to burn. The night was ending. The altitude belonged to America, and the sound of 8.50 caliber machine guns tearing through thin air would become the acoustic signature of air superiority. Sustained, abundant, unstoppable. Robert Johnson returned to Pennsylvania after the war, worked in insurance, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat service except at reunions with other 56 Fighter Group veterans. He died in 1998 at age 78. His obituary mentioned his Medal of Honor nomination, which was downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross due to bureaucratic procedures, and his status as an ace. It didn't mention March 15th specifically. It didn't need to. Every pilot who had flown that mission knew what it meant. They had climbed to altitudes that the enemy believed were safe and proven that nothing was safe anymore, that American fighters could reach any altitude where German aircraft operated, that the material advantages of industrial democracy could be applied at 30,000 feet as effectively as at sea level. The truth that emerged from that engagement, the truth that would define American air power for the remainder of the war and decades beyond, was neither subtle nor complex. Superior equipment, properly employed, defeats superior experience. Abundance, systematically applied, overcomes conservation and rationing. And the sound of sustained automatic fire, that tearing roar of 8 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously, communicated more about American industrial capacity than any propaganda or strategic assessment could convey. It was the sound of factories in Connecticut producing ammunition by the millions. It was the sound of logistics chains stretching across oceans. It was the sound of a nation that could afford to fire thousands of rounds in a single engagement because thousands more would arrive tomorrow. It was the sound of victory, cyclic and persistent and ultimately inevitable, echoing through thin air at altitudes where breathing required oxygen and cold penetrated every flight suit, where German pilots discovered that altitude was no longer sanctuary and the Americans they expected to meet below were instead waiting above. March 15, 1944, was the day 23 German fighters fell from sky they thought they owned. The day Luftwaffe intelligence assessments proved catastrophically wrong. The day altitude advantage transferred from defenders to attackers. The day American industrial superiority manifested as tactical dominance at 30,000 feet. The engagements would continue for 14 more months. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The P-47s that German intelligence said couldn't climb that high had climbed higher still. The ammunition that should have been exhausted kept firing. The industrial capacity that was supposed to be neutralized by strategic bombing kept producing. And the air war over Europe, which Germany needed to win to survive, had been irretrievably lost in the span of one afternoon above the German-Belgian border, where the sky was too thin to breathe and too cold to survive, but not too high for American fighters to reach and not too hostile for American pilots to dominate. The sound echoes still, that distinctive roar of .50 caliber abundance, fired without concern for conservation because more would always arrive, fired at altitudes that were supposed to be impossible, fired until the enemy broke and fled and learned that nowhere was safe anymore, that altitude was no longer advantage, that the Americans had climbed to meet them and would keep climbing, keep firing, keep pressing until the last German fighter was grounded and the last Luftwaffe pilot admitted what March 15th had proven. The sky no longer belonged to those who had owned it for 5 years. It belonged to those who could produce enough ammunition to fill it with fire, enough fuel to reach any altitude, enough aircraft to replace losses without pause. It belonged to abundance. It belonged to democracy's industrial fury. It belonged to 8 guns firing in perfect synchronization, tearing through thin air, announcing that the future had arrived, and it sounded like thunder.